The Kenya School of Government is at the center of public service transformation as envisioned in Vision 2030. This week on Inside Government, our focus is on public service transformation, and we are talking to Kenya School of Government Director General Dr. Ludeki Chweya. Thank you very much indeed for finding time to be with us this afternoon. Where are we in terms of bringing a new energy and new face into Kenya's public service?
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, it's correct that the government has been trying so hard to bring about transformation in our public service, in the way in which the public service is organized, the way in which it is steered, and the way in which it responds to citizen interests. And I think the point of departure in this, on that subject has to be the transition to independence. We had a tremendous challenge at that time because independence came about at a time when the public service was dominated at the higher levels and the middle levels and even lower levels by European officers. And independence meant that the European officers had to give way for African administrators, African officials. Mm-hmm. And the challenge at that time was that African officers had not been prepared adequately to take up responsibilities at those levels, the middle and the upper levels. And so there was the challenge of capacity, challenge of competency, of skills and expertise among prospective African civil servants. And so, quite obviously, the solution was to create an institution that could very quickly develop the required skills and competencies among these officials. And this is how come the Kenya Institute of Administration was set up in mid-1961. I know someone might say, but we got independence in 1963. But by 1960, it was clear that independence was coming. Mm-hmm. You know, we had the first Lancaster House Constitutional Conference in 1960. And one of the resolutions at that conference was that Africans be allowed, because it had been prohibited, be allowed to rise to senior levels in the public service, a process that was referred to at that time as Africanization of the civil service. Mm. So that was quite clear that independence was coming. And so that's why the following year, in 1961, preparations had to be made by way of establishing KIA and introducing in KIA training programs that would be rolled out rapidly because there wasn't much time. And so there were crash programs and so on. So that was the starting point. Then it wasn't easy because even in the years immediately after independence, we still had to rely substantially on expatriates and so on. This went on up to, I think, about the end of the 1960s, when we now had Africanized, shall we say, or Kenyanized, some people said, Kenyanized the civil service. Yeah. And now, from about the beginning of the 1970s, the challenge was no longer having the skills that were required, but getting the civil service to actually deliver services to citizens. At that time, the greatest challenge that the public service had to grapple with was development. And you know, there were three main goals: eradication of disease, of illiteracy and ignorance, and poverty. Yeah, and so we had development plans, 5-year development plans that were formulated, and the civil service was required to implement these development plans.
And even before you proceed, let's still remain in the era of 1960, during the Africanization of the Kenyan public service. And a lot of people and scholars argue that this is where Kenya got it wrong in trying to Africanize or Kenyanize, the public service, because you had so many people who were given very high responsibilities, but they were not qualified for the same. As a scholar and as a Director General of KSG, do you buy into that idea?
I don't buy into the idea that it was wrong to do what we did.
Well, the argument has always been that this is when we started getting it wrong.
I don't buy that, that we started off by getting it right. Because remember this, we had been a colony, and there is nothing good in being a colony. And then we had a nationalist movement very actively playing its role to liberate the country. We had the state of emergency declared in 1952, and then we had a number of constitutional negotiations taking place between 1959 and 1963, and then we got independence. Now, what does independence mean? Independence means that the citizens of the country should run their own affairs. Now, if that is wrong, then one might probably have to argue that colonialism should have stayed on for a little longer until, the Africans had received sufficient education and training to be able to run their own affairs. Would you buy that argument? The answer is no. And so we had a challenge, the challenge of having to run a country, deliver services to citizens, promote national development, when we didn't have adequate human competency to do so. So the solution was not in inviting Europeans to do the job for us. The solution was in developing the competencies that we needed among the African civil servants, and which we did. And KIA was on hand to do that, and they did a great job. Among other institutions, the University of Nairobi was established, as you know, first as a college of the University of East Africa, and from about 1970 becoming an autonomous university, being able to generate the human resource we needed to run the civil service and other sectors of the society and the economy. So I think that we did a good job.
Let's revisit the Africanization policy that was rolled out back in 1965 by the government of the then founding president, the late Mzee Jomo Kenyatta. And top civil servants were given targets that in your department, we want you to reduce the number of senior managers who are non-African, by this percentage. And so people argue that in a bid to beat the deadline, a lot of things were overlooked back then. People who were not deserving were given positions. Do you also agree with that, or you are of contrary opinion?
I am of contrary opinion. Okay, let's put it this way, that it is better that a ministry should be run, for example, a ministry should be run by people who are properly trained, have university degrees in the appropriate fields, and have other complementary training qualifications that are required in the portfolios that are assigned.
That's core competence.
Yeah, the core competencies they ought to have. It is better that we have such highly trained people. But remember this, there is research that tells us that at the time of independence, we only had 6 economists in Kenya. 6 Kenyan, African, or shall we say Kenyan economists.
Indigenous Kenyan.
Indigenous Kenyan economists. Do you see? Now, with that kind of level of human resource development, would you still argue that we needed highly qualified, highly trained officials in every field? It would be better, but not practical, because we didn't have. And yet, we needed to run our own affairs as an independent country, an independent nation. And let me put it this way, that you are better off in the context of colonialism and the immediate post-colonial situation to run your own affairs yourselves with whatever resources that you have available to you, including human resources, and there should be no regret about that.
In 2008, and back then you were still in government, you know, when the Vision 2030 was rolled out, the document was very clear that in a bid to achieve the aspirations of Vision 2030, there was a strong desire to reform the public sector, to make it efficient, to make it lean, to make it functional. And one area that was highlighted was the retraining and capacity building in public service. And there was a need to reform and to reorganize the Kenya, back then it was Kenya Institute of Administration. And now given a new mandate, an emboldened mandate, no wonder it was named the Kenya School of Government. When you look back at the mandate of Kenya School of Government and the role of this institution in reforming and helping make the public service in Kenya more efficient and much leaner, do you think we have lived to those aspirations?
Yes, we have. And we are on the path to reaching the promised land that was defined in the Kenya Vision 2030. As you know, the Kenya Vision 2030 document, it's actually a development blueprint that seeks, as it says, to transform this country into a middle-income nation where citizens enjoy high standards of life. And here in Kenya, you will have already come across people talking about how, you know, Kenya and Singapore and Korea and Malaysia were at par at some point, and how these other countries have been able to leap forward and leaving Kenya behind and so on. That argument is always made. Not an argument, observation is always made. And the question always is why Kenya couldn't make such leaps also as others previously in the same category have done. And so in the year 2008, yes, the government decided to develop a blueprint which, if followed closely, would enable the country actually reach the same levels that our colleagues in the newly industrialized world have already reached. And this was the purpose of the Kenya Vision 2030. Now, the realization of the economic goals in that vision document and even the social goals, even the political and governance goals, depended, and it was acknowledged in the Vision 2030 document, depended on a well-functioning, a transformed, efficient, effective public service. Put differently, it is the public service that was expected to steer the country towards those goals. Of course, the private sector it has a tremendous role to play in this, but the argument was that the performance of the private sector will depend on the effectiveness of the public service, because the public service has to create the appropriate environment and conditions for the private sector to thrive in. So whichever way you look at it, the realization of the goals of the Kenya Vision 2030 depended on the transformation, a priori transformation of the public service. Now, so what kind of public service was envisaged? A public service that was results-oriented, which would mark a departure from the dominant characteristic of the previous period, where the public service largely also paid homage to processes rather than outcomes. For example, an individual public servant would say the day has been successful if he came in at 8 and left at 5. But that is a process. But we had to depart from that and ask the question, yes, you are in from 8 to 5, but what did you achieve? What targets did you achieve?
What was the productivity level?
Productivity level during those 8 hours or so when you are in the office. So a public service that would be results-oriented. And number 2, a public service that would focus, prioritize actually, the needs and interests of the citizens. So a public service that is not self-serving, but one that would be responding to the needs of the citizens. And the key word is citizen-centered public service. So those were the 2 main goals of the public service transformation program that was envisaged under the Kenya Vision 2030. And so the question then was, who will transform the public service in the ways that we have mentioned? And the answer in the Vision 2030 document was straightforward. Let us create a Kenya School of Government and mandate the new institution with the responsibility of bringing about such transformation as we desire in the public service. And so truly the Kenya School of Government was established with effect from 1st July 2012. And it had a wider mandate compared to the predecessor institution such as KIA and even the government training institutes in Mombasa, Matuga, Embu, Baringo, that then became campuses of the Kenya School of Government. So the broader mandate of the school was, number 1, to provide training, because skills, competencies, and knowledge are so important for an institution that is seeking to bring about and to steer change in a country. And then number 2, a country that is seeking to realize rapid change in the manner envisaged in the vision document requires policies, formulation of new policies that are based on verified, objective evidence. So research became a second most important mandate of the Kenya. The third was consultancy services. The Kenya School of Government was required to support government institutions through consultancy services so far as the reforms in their structure, in their orientation was concerned. And then fourth, the school was expected to provide policy advisory now to government in critical areas of public service.
Are you convinced that in the last 9 years that KSG has been in place, are you convinced that it has managed to play these 4 broad roles accordingly?
Yes, the school has done well in fulfilling its mandate under the legislation that established the school and also under the expectations contained in the Kenya Vision 2030 development agenda. We have done this by way of training. So far as training is concerned, we have either introduced new programs in areas previously not thought about, areas like environmental governance and climate change. We now have a training in that. New areas like social protection that is meant to ensure that the development process, the benefits of development reach every member of the society, including the vulnerables, because development can occur and only reach certain categories of the population. We have training programs that that ensure that this is the way it's going. We have programs that touch on children, like preparation of child-friendly budgets, and so on. And then we have also revised some of the old programs in order to bring them up to date with the changing realities in the environment in which public service is set. For example, we had a program in leadership called Strategic Leadership Development Program. Now, it is still a very important program, but we had to revise the syllabus and bring it up to date. Senior management course, we had to revise the syllabus. And then we also made sure that we reached out to other sectors of the public service previously not sufficiently catered for by our predecessor institutions. And this is specifically the parastatal sector. Good. So we now have training programs dedicated to the needs of state corporations, including the boards, the management, and so on. Yeah. And then we have the counties. You know, in between, devolution came about, and it was a new way of managing public affairs, decentralized way of managing public affairs, 47 counties, you know, and so on. And so we had to very quickly develop appropriate programs that would support the efforts of counties in trying to make sure that they meet their obligation under the Constitution and under the legislation, the different pieces of legislation upon which county government is anchored. So we've done that as well.
As an institution that was based on training physical or physical classes, how impacted have you been by COVID-19?
Thank you very much. The COVID-19 came in so abruptly and took us by surprise, as it did the whole world. And so we were affected, first of all, very adversely, because you will recall the first step government took was to protect citizens by closing down institutions that included the Kenya School of Government. So we closed the school for almost 8 months. Now that hurt us significantly.
Your bottom line, that is.
Bottom line, right? Because the Kenya School of Government is expected to run its operations on internally generated budget revenues, all right? So with the school shut down, then our inlet valve was shut down. And so we really panicked. And that's the sense in which I say we were affected very, very adversely. But like all institutions, and like an institution that is responsible for training public servants, we now had to do what we always asked public servants to do in their institutions, which is to be creative, to be innovative, and to be adaptive. And so we very quickly made arrangements to ensure that there is continuity of our programs, even as we shut down physical interactions and so on, and even as we discontinued the in-person training programs, for example. So fortunately, we already had the E-Learning and Development Institute, an institute that had been established, and we are thankful to our predecessors because they had foresight. An institution that had been established 10 years earlier and so on, before the Kenya School of Government was established. And this institute had been established for the purpose of facilitating distance training, so that people who require training, who require knowledge and skills can be reached without those individuals actually physically coming over to the school. Yeah. And so we are also very thankful to government. I think the government had the foresight by introducing optic fiber network and so on and so forth. And so what we did, therefore, was to place most of our training programs online.
So you decided to go virtual?
We decided to go virtual.
How badly hit were your finances by the COVID in the 8 months?
Significantly. but fortunately, we had a little reserve. Don't tell anyone this. A little reserve. No one is listening. Which is a measure of good governance. I don't know whether I'm coming through as somebody praising himself, but it simply meant that we had managed the institution well by not consuming everything, by keeping some kind of savings to be used on a rainy day. This time, the rainy day actually came. And so the little reserve became very, very useful and kept us going. And I'm sure you have not heard of news from the Kenya School of Government to the effect that salaries have not been paid or even have been delayed.
Very well.
We have continued to run.
So going forward, because we always talk about Vision 2030 in this country, which is about 9 or less years away from where we are now. What kind of a public service do you expect to see or do you foresee?
I see a public service not long from now. We already are nearly there. A public service that is comparable to the best around the world, which means a public service that lives up to the expectations of what scholars these days call institutional development. So this is a public service that abides by all the best practice that has been developed for a modern public service. Quick examples. A public service that focuses on realization of targets, a results-based public service. And already, you know, we have performance contracting. Each year, every government institution and ministry is expected to develop targets, to sign up those targets, and to work towards the realization of those targets in the year, and to be evaluated at the end of the year on the basis of those targets, and so on. So something like that. Then performance management has become a critical phenomenon in our public service. That is to say, a public service that public servants, individual public servants, are assessed on the basis of what they have actually delivered, the productivity you just mentioned. So we have performance appraisal system. Every individual civil servant has to account for every hour and every day he or she spent at work, and so on. And promotion and so on will be based upon such considerations.
So that's the kind of public service that you foresee?
That we foresee, and we are getting nearly there. Also, a public service institution that abides by such fundamental standards, such as, preparation of strategic plans. So you function on the basis of clearly defined roadmap and not just groping up in the dark. There is no public service institution today that does not have a strategic plan and which is reviewed regularly. Then a public service that abides by standards of operation. Now, nearly every public service institution has achieved or is working towards the achievement of ISO standard. So this is going to be the case, including matters to do with accountability, matters to do with ethics and integrity, matters to do with good governance defined broadly.
Very good.
Go on and on.
Vision 2030 is coming. We shall be here, and of course, we shall revisit this discussion with you.
Thank you. I look forward to it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
This has been Inside Government. Thank you very much for finding time to be with us this afternoon. My name is O'Brien Kimani. Have a good afternoon.